the road. Thank you again for coming. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we'll talk about our national forests with the executive team at the National Forest Foundation. Our guests are Mary Mitsos, President and CEO, Executive Vice President Ray Foote, and Vice President Marcus Selig. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all for joining us. And it seems that Ray, oh, there you go. Your camera is just resolved. Thank you very much for coming in. You know, this is a really interesting topic because we're in a situation where we are diverted by pandemic, by economic dislocation, by political season where we have the US presidential elections. Why in this environment where we have so much to care about, where we are traumatized by so much, should we be caring about our national forests? Mary, you care to take a shot at that?
I'd love to take a shot at that, Mark. Thank you so much for inviting us to participate today. I think the public needs to care about our national forests. It's an unknown asset to many. And forests clean our water, they clean our air, they provide wildlife habitat, they provide solace and recreation for people who can get outside, especially during a pandemic. And it is one of the greatest public assets that the United States has. So you as a citizen are part owner in 193 million acres across the country.
So that's really interesting. So you're saying that the forests act as a filtration system for our air and for our water.
Correct.
So if it's a filtration system for our air and water, then what happens if the forests start to disappear? And we're seeing that in the Amazon. We're seeing that with the burning that goes across the West. I'm going to go over to Marcus next, and I'll come back to you, Ray. But what happens, Marcus, if the forests start to diminish here in the United States? Can't we, through our technology, through direct filtration of water or some other way, replace that and then use the land for other purposes, farming, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you know, unfortunately, we're getting to see it at some small scales as we do lose our forests to extreme wildfire. And when we have that, we see a couple things happen. So one is we do lose this carbon sink. Instead of gathering carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we lose that if the trees don't regrow. Once they start regrowing and we can do some replanting, we can help rebuild the forest. But in that interim, we're losing that carbon sink, which is incredibly important from a climate change standpoint. From a water standpoint, when we lose these forests, we see incredible post-fire flooding and the effects it has downstream, not only for habitat, but for water intakes for municipal governments. Is extreme as well. Huge amounts of sedimentation, loss of infrastructure as pipes, and sometimes even wash away. We can't keep up with what the green infrastructure provides. And so we can't engineer around it. And then when we try to, the cost is exorbitant. It's much cheaper to protect our green infrastructure, protect our water filters and our water sources than it is to address it on the back end after we lose them.
So that's really interesting. If we take, let's take 2 different cities. Let's take New York, which famously is supplied by the Catskills water infrastructure. And you take Los Angeles, which has the LA River running through it, which looks like a concrete culvert, except at times when there's flooding, in which case it has to move an enormous amount of water through urban environments. So, Ray, when you're looking at this point of why we should care, and let's take someone who lives within a concrete environment of these cities. I think what Marcus is saying is that actually the water supply infrastructure of both of those cities is actually, the forests are part of the engineering that we have neglected that supply water and ecosystems that allow these urban environments to even exist. Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, no, that's well said, Mark. And just to build a little bit on that and what Marcus and Mary said, I live in Washington, D.C. So even though many would say that Washington is a very green city, some would say it's a very swampy city. There is a really sort of engineering, technical, and even really philosophical difference in what we call green engineering and gray engineering, green infrastructure and gray infrastructure. And what Marcus talked about is that resilient, soft, always changing green infrastructure. A key difference is, gray infrastructure is pipes and beams and pumps, and it's stuff that we create. And it is welded in place and fixed in place. It doesn't adapt. It's not resilient. It is what it is until it breaks, and then it has to be fixed at extremely high cost. Green infrastructure, our forests, are these amazing, living, changing things. And when there are scars to the land, over time they heal, and their ecosystem function returns so they can filter water. They can catch the snow, hold it, release it slowly, so that as trees begin to grow, they hit those peak carbon absorption rates, in the early and mid years. So there's just a real big difference in gray and green. And the national forest at 193 million acres are really a centerpiece of this country's green infrastructure. And beyond just kind of the kind of tangible count water and air benefits, Mary touched on recreation. 170 million Americans each year get out and have fun on national forest lands, hiking, skiing, biking, camping, bird watching, hunting, fishing, you name it. So another reason to care is about this very human interface where millions of Americans are out having fun, and also, by the way, spending $13 to $15 billion a year directly on national forest recreation. So there's an economic benefit to healthy forests as well.
And I guess what you're all saying is very similar to what we're learning about wetlands and the protection that the wetlands afford cities like New Orleans or Houston or coastal cities, in which those wetlands act as a buffer during hurricane season. And when you remove the wetlands and you pave over too much, you end up with massive flooding, and then we end up with population dislocation, like we saw during the Katrina catastrophe, or as we see through successive years of flooding in Houston. Mary, I didn't mean to cut you off. You wanted to make a point.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on something Ray said that I think that we forget. I think humans often think that nature just exists, but it's green infrastructure, as Ray and Marcus both pointed out. And like any infrastructure, nature needs to be maintained at times too. So there are things that we as humans can do to make our forests more resilient and continue to provide the benefits. What we don't want to do is get to the place where we're not paying enough attention and losing our forests, because then issues start to cascade in a negative way.
Do we have to start looking at these ecosystems a little bit like we look at ourselves? As we get older, we might get a pacemaker, or we might get a hearing aid. 3 of us on this program have glasses, right? So they're manufactured pieces. We receive medical care, right? But there's also the biologic system that is ourselves. And as we age, there's this sort of combination, and that sort of makes a whole quality of life. And maybe the way we need to start thinking about our grasslands, our wetlands, our forests, our oceans, as part of an entire system where there is no separation between the urban environment and the urban environment which consumes waters from the Catskills. Ray?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned grasslands, Mark, because, and I know this is something near and dear to Mary's heart, being a Midwesterner. We're doing a lot of work at the Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie, which is only about 45 miles outside of Chicago. So one of the most urban areas in the country. And here's this 20,000 acre plot of land where when you're talking about things that like wearing glasses or, thinking of it as a human body, things we need to do this was an area that went from grassland in the 18th century to agriculture in the 19th century to an industrial landscape in the 20th century. We're now, with a lot of other partners, bringing it back to native grasslands. And those deep roots hold tons of carbon in the ground. And then another example would be out in the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming, where after a really severe fire, the trees just weren't going to come back. There's not a lot of water out there like there is in my home state of Louisiana. But after 30 years, I think the Forest Service concluded we really need to replant. So that was very active, intervention with funding from the National Forest Foundation to plant 30, 40,000 trees to give that forest a chance to regenerate. So these are little surgical things.
Let's talk a little bit about food supply as well. Here in this country, we went through a process in which we were an agriculturally based economy, and we became an industrially based economy. And then as we grew, we needed to have industrial farming. Industrial farming is the thing that allows our population, our expanded population, to be fed, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing. And we're all accustomed to seeing these nice fields, sometimes really massive, of monoculture corn or whatever. It seems that, though, that we're now finding that leaves real vulnerability in our food supply. And as we eliminate and we become more efficient, we also become less resilient. One of the questions that I have here is, what is the role of these natural habitats in assuring resilience? And does biodiversity have a utility beyond the philosophical, right? So Marcus, do you mind dealing with that?
Yeah, you bet. So I think it's a great question. It's a great point. And I think you're absolutely right that biodiversity does have value beyond the sake of biodiversity. As we've been talking about, these are complex natural ecosystems. We understand a bit about them, and there's a lot we don't understand about how they operate. And we've shown in the past with some of our management decisions how little we understand about them. We're getting smarter every year. We're making better management decisions every year. But what we're realizing is that the ecological processes that are there are some of the most resilient processes that we have. And so what we need to do is manage for as much biodiversity as possible, because we don't know the effect of limiting that. And if we have that biodiversity, we're going to have a more stable, more resilient ecosystem. These ecosystems have been around for thousands, probably thousands and thousands of years, and they've persisted, and they've been stable, and they've been resilient. When we're starting to see them change is when we intervene by limiting biodiversity, limiting processes that would naturally occur. If we let them occur, it will find a balance again. And what we're seeing in our forest management now is moving towards more of that natural process. So we're not trying to manage forests anymore in a type of monoculture that you mentioned with like food and agriculture. We're trying to set them back on a natural trajectory and reintroduce natural processes that will make them more resilient. And to do that, we need biodiversity.
What's interesting is we just completed a poll in which the respondents seem to agree with you that the biggest benefit of having open public land is to promote biodiversity and conservation, with non-commercial use also gaining a lot of support. I guess one of the questions that I have is why we're not paying attention to human history. If you take a look at what happened when the Greeks denuded those areas of Greece, forests, you had previously navigable channels silted up through erosion, which you pointed to, Marcus. You had, because trees had been cut, they would not regrow. The climate actually changed. And a lot of those communities ended up becoming wanderers because the land would no longer sustain them. So the real question becomes, and we can see that in Appalachia, which, not Appalachia, in the Adirondacks in New York, where clear cutting had destroyed once thriving communities that had relied on the steel industry. The real question becomes, how do we move forward? Can we actually repair, or are we on a trajectory in which our own self-interest is going to lead us to take action which harm us? Ray, what do you think?
Oh, I was hoping that question would go to Mary.
Okay, Mary. Mary, go ahead.
Too. We're all optimists. We're all optimists.
I mean, I think you bring up some great history, Mark, but I think we are learning. We just sometimes are a little slow. So I'll point out that the national forests and grasslands were created because of learning from places like Greece and what we did to the east as European settlers started coming through. And so Gifford Pinchot and President Roosevelt realized that we need forests in order to supply water and have timber and have settlements. So we do eventually learn. I think what the learnings that we're having right now is the Forest Service became so effective at suppressing fires because they thought all fires were bad. And yet before, when the Native Americans were here, they lit fires all the time to promote food and safety and wildlife habitat. So we have finally learned and are learning we need more fire on the landscape, but good fire like the Native Americans did. And we have to speed up taking some of the biomass, some of the trees off the forest before we can introduce good fire, but I think we're on the right trajectory.
Mark, can I add to that? One of the probably the biggest challenges for natural resource managers in the Forest Service today is that we can't necessarily mimic or go back to exact natural processes because there's a balance now. Because we utilize our forests and we live in our forests in a way that we can't do what nature originally did. We can't have fire at the scale that might have burned naturally because people don't want the smoke. They don't want the fire that close to their home. We have recreation and other infrastructure in our forests that affect how we manage it. So there is always a push and pull of natural processes that we know are resilient that we want to reintroduce to our forests, but also how we use them and how we've grown accustomed to having these lands around us.
I would just add that those are great points. I would just add that we also see real progress in maybe some unexpected ways. So even though we're not an advocacy group, we're not lobbying and litigating, we're doing a lot of work on the ground. And we're seeing not only volunteers coming forward and making a change, but corporations increasingly recognizing how intertwined the health of our environment is with their profitability and the importance it carries with their employees. And so, we got a tremendous source of support from the VF Corporation to create this front range strike team in Colorado to get volunteers out to do trail maintenance. Partners like REI, or we're planting 1 million trees with REI. Their customers are out there, enjoying national forest. And companies are increasingly discovering these public lands they're in great need. They're in huge need. I mean, the estimates of the number of acres of the national forest system that need some kind of restoration, 70 million, 75, 80 million. Those are huge numbers. But there are lots and lots of local groups, national groups like the NFF, who are digging into this and, collectively making a big difference.
And the poll that we just completed indicates that everybody believes that the forests and open grasslands are important to our environment. My biggest concern, though, is that we live in our own micro bubbles. I do, each of you do, and whatever we perceive is are the things that we come into contact with, the people we come into contact with, the positive reinforcement that we receive. Yet year after year, decade after decade, century after century, there is an erosion of these natural habitats. And the question ends up becoming, to what extent can we tamp down our own selfish interest to instead advocate for a communal one? Do you believe that part of this is a matter of creating a different value set almost in the same way that religious movements have, right? Where you start identifying your own behavior with the other and deciding that we're not going to be the consumers that we were, deciding that the convenience of buying a cardboard box in which are a whole bunch of plastic bags that you can easily slip sandwiches in or food into, and ending up with this huge amount of plastic. That may be that kind of convenience we're not going to do. And instead we're going to get glass and, a screw top lid, and we're going to reuse that and wash it and so on. We kind of have to really change ourselves in ways that we've never really had to.
Well, Mark, I agree. I think we also have to kind of change our understanding of how our beliefs and habits get sort of calcified. For 50 years now, who have been some of the most vocal champions and advocates for sustainable practices? It's been our children. It's been younger people who have pushed adults to think about the future. We have children. They do it all the time. It's not just the recycling bin in the kitchen, but, thinking about how much we drive. We've got friends who just as a family, they sat down together and their kids said, we want to make our household carbon neutral. So I do think there you've got a little bit, I won't say a clash of values, but you've got some idealistic values of younger people who are trying to kind of push that up into those of us who become older and who maybe lose some of that idealism. So I think that's and we're seeing it currently in the climate change debate. Consistently, younger people are this source of energy for more sustainable practices.
Could you talk about your views of how different actors here on an individual basis, on a business basis, on a government basis, how this needs to evolve? You do have in this country these incredible debates about coercion, government control, regulation, all these different aspects. And then there's the education piece, where people are saying that one side or the other is indoctrinating. We're either being educated to be natural consumers or educated to be conservationists and so on. Everything seems to be political. How do we navigate this space so that we end up with a better environment in terms of our human interactions that result in a more sustainable ecosystem that protects national forests, protects grasslands? How do we do that? How do we reach across different perspectives?
So Mark, that's a great question. And I have kind of a twofold response. One, if there is any such thing as a silver lining or an upside to a pandemic, part of it is that a broader segment of the public now better understands the importance of nature. It has been the solace for many to be able to get outside and do something that they've never done before. So RV sales are through the roof. Boats you can't find anymore. Bikes are a year behind in manufacture. So people are beginning to understand better the value of nature, and let's hope that continues. So I think on the education side, I can only go back to how I learn best, and I learn best always by being shown something new and be able to touch it and feel it and understand it for myself. So part of our mission is to really engage the American public in that enjoyment and stewardship of the national forest system. And it's a long battle because it's hard to engage everybody, but every time you get one more new voice and passionate person involved, we're on the uphill side.
So that was interesting. Marcus, I'll come back to you in a second. I just wanted to announce the result of the third poll, which is interesting because we asked how often people visited the national forests. Over half said annually. Once a month was about 10%. And then every few years and rarely got about 40% of the vote, actually 36% of the vote. What you're saying, Mary, is that exposure is really important, right? Education is really important. Marcus, why don't you go on?
Well, I was just gonna, in my mind, there's a spectrum of how people can engage. And so what Mary was talking about with folks getting out during the pandemic and just getting out and building that love and appreciation for national forests is the first engagement point. And then there's engagement points beyond that we hope build from that. So, one of the great things about public lands is one of those points in the spectrum is a feeling of ownership and responsibility, because everyone can participate in how public lands are managed. Every major decision on public lands goes through a public engagement process where you can voice your opinion, you can comment on it, and you can learn what others are thinking about how our land should be managed too. So that's another step. And then there's, a step beyond that once you have that love and you have that ownership, hopefully you do become an advocate or an educator to help others understand how they can take care of their land as well too. And what we hope everybody gets to selfishly at National Forest Foundation is wanting to then give support to help their public lands. After they have that love, they have that ownership, they're advocating, then they can financially support it. And that's what we're here for, is to help them do proactive work on our national forests.
I think part of what you all are saying is that we no longer have the luxury. It's sort of like the ecosystem argument, right? We can't see the forest separate from the cities. That was when you, Marcus, talked about, erosion of roads, because in the aftermath of fires, you have rains that then strip the soil, and then all of a sudden you find roadbeds that are running through these areas undermined, right? I mean, there is a direct connection between how we live in cities and how our forests are preserved. In the same way, we as organizations can no longer just be purely advocacy or purely planting trees or purely this or purely that. Part of this is to galvanize, it's basically galvanize knowledge and communicate with each other. So is part of your work to talk with people who are completely in a different space, might not see things the way you do, might oppose some of the things that you do, as part of your responsibility to engage with people and try and convince, try to share, try to be informed by their perspective. Ray, I see you nodding vigorously. Care to elucidate?
I love this idea that you're raising, Mark, about overcoming barriers. For more than a dozen years now, the National Forest Foundation has been running a really effective program called Conservation Connect that is exactly what you're talking about. It's literally to bring together around the table, metaphorically and literally, representatives of very, very divergent viewpoints. So you've got motorized recreation, timber interest, environmentalists, quiet recreation, local business, water quality experts. So everyone sees the forest through their own lens. Everyone sees the forest as something where they can maybe extract or give back or enjoy or share with others. But our job as a nonpartisan, non-advocate group is to find that common ground. And it's amazing, with enough time, and these processes do take real time, those barriers can come down, because while people may have lots of different positions, they often have shared interest, and that is a healthy forest. And that's a powerful thing.
Marcus, let's go to you, and then Mary, we'll end up with you. We're coming to the end of our time. Marcus, how do you see this interaction between partners, people who are sitting on the other side of this proverbial table? How do you see creating the change in America that results in forests that are growing as opposed to diminishing?
Well, I mean, I think Ray said it well, is that everyone recognizes this value of a healthy forest, and we all need to recognize that value of a healthy forest, no matter where you're coming to it from, whatever lens you're looking through. They have to take that individual vision, put it together into a shared vision, and let science guide it. We have a lot of great science. The U.S. Forest Service knows more about forests and the science of forests than any other entity in the world. Let's take that information, let's take individual visions and put it together to manage the lands the best we can. And the only thing, if we can do that, the only thing we're lacking then is potentially the resources to get it done. And that's when everybody can come together, when they have that shared vision, and support it financially, with their in-kind efforts to get done what needs to be done on the landscape.
And Mary, do you see us in a conservation game or in an expansion game going forward? Do you see a day when our forests actually increase acreage?
As a nation, yes. I wouldn't say as the national forests, right? Those 193 million acres are pretty set. They might expand a little, but yes, I think there's a big movement afoot now that that is really beginning to understand the importance of forests. And so private landowners are getting involved, state and local government is getting involved, as well as the national level. So yes, I think that again, we're on that upward trend that will gain more forests back.
A very optimistic note on which to end. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and the work of the National Forest Foundation. Mary, Mitsos, Ray Foote, Marcus Selig, thank you so much for the work of your staff, your volunteers, your board members, your funders. That's the Nonprofit Report, everyone. Thank you, attendees, for coming and sharing your questions with us. And we'll see you again next Tuesday. Have a great day.
Thanks, Mark.